The man who wrote the riffs that defined a generation. The right hand who stood beside Jon Bon Jovi for 30 years. And the brother who, one night in 2013, simply vanished. No fight. No final word. Just silence. Now, at 65, Richie Sambora is finally speaking, and his words are cutting deeper than anyone ever expected. He's exposing the secret deal, the manipulation, and the heartbreaking truth behind his sudden departure that left millions of fans wondering what really happened. Before we uncover what really happened, tell us in the comments, what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding about this story? It was May 2013, and the Bon Jovi tour was rolling through Canada with the usual precision of a machine that had been running for 3 decades. Thousands of fans packed into the Saddledome in Calgary, ready for a night of classic anthems and arena rock spectacle. But something was wrong before the first note was even played. Backstage, tension hung so thick you could cut it with a guitar string. Richie Sambora was there, but he wasn't really there. His eyes told a story his mouth never could. Hours before showtime, Sambora retreated to his dressing room. This wasn't unusual. The guitarist had always been the more contemplative half of the songwriting duo, the Ian to Jon Bon Jovi's relentless young. He needed his space. He needed to prepare. But this time, the preparation never ended. The show started. The crowd roared. Jon took the stage with that $1 million smile, and the band launched into You Give Love a Bad Name. But the signature riff that had opened thousands of shows before was missing. Richie's guitar was silent. Sambora never walked out. He never picked up his instrument. He sat in that dressing room while his brother-in-arms performed without him, and then, without telling a single soul, he packed his things and left. He got into his car and drove away into the Canadian night. No explanation. No goodbye. Just a disappearing act that would become one of rock's greatest mysteries. The band finished the show. Jon delivered a performance that fooled everyone in the audience. But backstage, the panic was real. Crew members scrambled. Phones rang off the hook. Where was Richie? Why wasn't he answering his calls? The official story came quickly, too quickly. A personal matter. A family issue. Something vague enough to satisfy the press but specific enough to make everyone wonder what had really gone wrong. But here's the truth that never made it to the press releases: Richie Sambora had been planning this exit for months, maybe years. He had been watching the band transform from a brotherhood into a business, and he knew that if he stayed any longer, he would lose himself entirely. That night in Calgary wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a survival instinct. The only move left for a man who had been suffocating in silence while everyone around him pretended everything was fine. In the hours that followed, Jon Bon Jovi made a statement to the press that was carefully crafted to protect the brand. He spoke about Richie's personal issues with a tone that suggested concern but carried an undercurrent of frustration. He made it sound like a temporary absence. He made it sound like a favor. But behind the scenes, the wheels were already turning. The narrative was being written, and Richie wasn't invited to contribute. The phone calls never came. The texts were left on read. And the brother who had stood beside Jon for 30 years suddenly became a ghost in his own story. The fans didn't know what to believe. The media spun theories. And Richie Sambora, the man who had co-written some of rock's most iconic anthems, was painted as the unreliable one. The one who couldn't handle the pressure. The weak link. But was that really the truth? Or was there something much darker unfolding behind the headlines? Something that Richie has kept bottled up for over a decade, waiting for the right moment to finally let it out? If you're enjoying this story, subscribe so you never miss our next documentary. For over a decade, the silence from Richie Sambora was deafening. He vanished from the spotlight, retreated from interviews, and let the world fill in the blanks. Meanwhile, Jon Bon Jovi controlled the narrative. In interviews, he spoke of Richie with a tone that suggested sympathy but carried the sting of abandonment. He described the night in Calgary as a mystery even he couldn't solve. He just didn't come to work, Jon said, painting a picture of a man who simply stopped showing up. But silence isn't emptiness. It's a holding pattern. And Richie was holding on to a truth he wasn't ready to share. What Jon never mentioned in those early interviews was that the band had been drifting apart long before that Canadian night. The creative chemistry that had defined them for 30 years had soured. The partnership that gave the world "Livin' on a Prayer" and "Wanted Dead or Alive" had become something unrecognizable. And the weight of pretending otherwise was crushing Richie from the inside. "I probably should have left after the Circle," Sambora later admitted, referring to the band's 2009 album. "Because I was really getting unhappy." That admission changes everything. It wasn't a sudden decision. It was years of quiet desperation building to a breaking point. The unhappiness wasn't about money or fame. It was about identity. Richie had always been the creative engine behind the guitar riffs, the harmonies, the blues-infused soul that separated Bon Jovi from other arena rock bands. But somewhere along the way, his voice stopped mattering. The band had become Jon's vehicle, and Richie was just a passenger. "Look, if anybody told Jon the truth, it was me," Sambora said. That single sentence contains the entire tragedy of their relationship. Richie was the one who could be honest with Jon. But honesty only works when both parties are willing to hear it. By 2013, Jon had stopped listening. The weight of that silence, the burden of being unheard while standing next to the most famous frontman in rock, finally became too heavy to carry. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. Money has a way of exposing the truth in any relationship. And for Richie Sambora, the business side of Bon Jovi revealed a fracture that no amount of sold-out arenas could hide. When he finally walked away in 2013, rumors swirled that the real issue was financial. Reports surfaced that Sambora had been making approximately $2 million a month and taking 20% of the concert profits, while his replacement was earning a fraction of that amount. The implication was clear: Richie wanted more, and Jon said no. But that narrative, like so many others, was incomplete. The money wasn't the problem. It was what the money represented. Decades earlier, the foundation of their business relationship had already been tested. When the band Skid Row was first starting out, Jon Bon Jovi offered them a tour slot in exchange for a publishing deal. The young band signed away their rights, and all publishing money went to Jon and Richie. It was only after a public dispute that Richie gave his share back, returning the money he had earned from songs he hadn't written. That gesture spoke volumes. Richie could have kept every penny. Instead, he chose fairness over profit. But the same generosity wasn't always extended to him. By the time Bon Jovi had become a global empire, the creative partnership that had built it was being treated like a corporate asset. Richie's solo career, his artistic identity outside the band, was quietly being undermined. In recent statements, he has openly claimed that Jon and the management team killed his solo records to force him back to the mothership. It wasn't personal, he clarified. It was business. Jon wanted him in the band, and the corporate machine wanted him there because Bon Jovi sold exponentially more records together than either of them did separately. This wasn't paranoia. It was the cold logic of an industry that prioritizes profit over passion. Richie had accepted it, but that didn't make it hurt any less. And then came the moment that broke everything. During the recording of What About Now, Richie returned to the studio energized after completing his solo album. Instead of the collaborative environment he expected, he found that Jon and producer John Shanks had already written most of the material. He was told not to worry about preparing anything. Just show up and play. That was the moment Richie realized he was no longer a creative partner. He was a hired hand. When he asked Jon to play him a song and then told him honestly that it didn't sound like Bon Jovi, the response was revealing. The band's signature sound had depended on Richie's contributions for 3 decades. Without that piece of the nucleus, the chemistry was gone. He had spent years telling Jon the truth while everyone else nodded along. But by 2013, Jon had stopped listening. And Richie realized that his voice, both in the studio and in the partnership, had become irrelevant. Behind the scenes, another chapter was quietly unfolding that would seal his fate forever. The documentary was supposed to be a celebration. 40 years of Bon Jovi, 40 years of hits, 40 years of brotherhood. But for Richie Sambora, watching Thank You, Goodnight, the Bon Jovi story felt like witnessing his own history being rewritten without his permission. When he sat down for his interview, he expected to reflect on the music that had defined generations. Instead, he walked into a room where the questions felt shallow, almost dismissive. The questions that were coming at me were unintelligent and did not demand any depth of answer, he later said. He stopped the interview midway and asked the director directly, "What are you looking for?" But his words, the ones that carried the weight of 32 years, barely made the final cut. What made it onto screen was Jon's version of events. And in Jon's version, Richie was the one who disappeared. The one who abandoned the band. The one who took years to apologize. It took him years to come back in the room just to have a meal with Tico, David, and I and say, "I'm sorry," Jon recounted on the Dumb Blonde podcast. "My heartbreak with him is the way he walked out on us." Jon framed the departure as a mystery, a wound he still carries. He claimed there was no fight, no money dispute, no animosity. He just didn't show up for the show, Jon said on Good Morning America, insisting he hadn't seen Richie in years. But the documentary that was supposed to be a reunion became another fracture. Sources close to Richie revealed that he flew to Jon's home to watch the series together, bringing a birthday gift, a beautiful guitar. But after 3 episodes, Richie left early. He was sick and tired of what he was seeing. He didn't like how his departure was framed. He felt the narrative turned him into the villain of a story he had helped write. "To me, the celebration would have been the great songs that we wrote and how we sold all those millions of records," Richie reflected. "I was in the band for 32 years, which is unbelievable anyway. That 5 guys could be married for 32 years, it's incredible." Jon, however, had a different read on the apology that finally came years later. When Richie did reach out, Jon acknowledged it, but the tone was one of relief rather than reconciliation. It was as if the wound had healed, but the scar remained. And for Richie, the very premise of needing to apologize was another misrepresentation of what had happened. He had walked away to survive. To save his family. To save himself. And yet, in the public eye, he became the unreliable one. The one who couldn't handle the pressure. The one who needed forgiveness. But behind the scenes, the truth was more complicated. Richie had been telling Jon the truth for years, even when no one else would. "Look, if anybody told Jon the truth, it was me," he said, reflecting on their final days together. He had watched the creative partnership dissolve into something corporate. He had been told not to worry about writing songs because Jon and producer John Shanks had already written 30 of them. He had heard the new material and realized it didn't sound like Bon Jovi. And when he tried to elevate a song like The Fighter with his signature touch, producer John Shanks played the part instead. That was the moment the band stopped being a band. "I went, do you want to just make it that way?" "Okay," Richie recalled. "See? Not a band." He had been sidelined in the studio, in the writing room, and in the narrative. Walking away wasn't abandonment. It was finally choosing himself. Now, at 65, he's done keeping the truth bottled up. If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video and subscribe for more true celebrity stories every week. The documentary aired. The world watched. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the two men might finally find common ground. Richie Sambora and Jon Bon Jovi actually sat down together to watch 3 episodes of Thank You, Goodnight, the Bon Jovi story at Jon's house. There was no animosity, Jon insisted. There was never a fight, he told the press. It sounded like the beginning of a reconciliation, the kind of Hollywood ending fans had been praying for since that night in Calgary. But behind the scenes, the wounds were still raw. When asked about the documentary, Richie's response was measured but revealing. "It's his project and it's his perspective," he told People magazine. "I have a different perspective on all of that." That simple statement said everything. Jon had controlled the narrative for over a decade, and now the documentary had cemented his version of history. Richie's perspective, the one that might have complicated the story, had been left on the cutting room floor. In response, Richie did something extraordinary. He released uncut footage from his documentary interview on Instagram, showing fans exactly what the filmmakers chose to leave out. In the extended footage, he explained the full weight of his decision, the tension within the band, the struggles with addiction, the need to be there for his daughter Ava and his ex-wife Heather Locklear, who was battling mental health issues. He even acknowledged that he didn't receive much compassion when he tried to return to the band after dealing with his personal tragedies. "I don't regret leaving the situation, but I regret how I did it," Sambora said in the documentary footage that did make the final cut. "So, I would like to apologize fully right now to the fans, especially also to the guys, because my feet and my spirit were just not letting me walk out the door." But Jon had been waiting for that apology for years. And the delay had already done its damage. "My heartbreak with him is the way he walked out on us, compounded by the fact that it took him years to come back in the room just to have a meal with Tico and David and I and say, 'I'm sorry,'" Jon admitted on the Dumb Blonde podcast. The apology had come, but for Jon, it felt like too little, too late. Yet the story doesn't end with a hug and a handshake. In fact, it may have taken a darker turn. In recent months, Richie Sambora has offered his most candid update yet about his relationship with Jon. When a fan asked directly if he still considered Jon his brother, Richie's answer was devastating: "Unfortunately not." He then added a cryptic promise that sent shockwaves through the fan community: "I'll wait to tell the truth." The phrase hung in the air like a warning. After all these years, after the documentary, after the apology, after the public appearances, Richie still believed the full truth hadn't been told. He also expressed frustration that fans give Jon all the credit for the band's success. "Unfortunately, I don't. They think Jon did everything," he said. And the band's future? When Bon Jovi announced their Forever Tour for 2026, Richie was nowhere near the lineup. He confirmed it himself: "Yes dear, they don't realize he wants me nowhere near this band." Reports suggested there was even a meeting where a potential reunion was discussed, but it fell apart over money. A source claimed Jon offered Richie only 10% of tour earnings, and the deal collapsed. For now, Bon Jovi continues without him. Phil X remains the guitarist. The machine keeps running. But the question that haunts every fan who ever sang along to "Livin' on a Prayer" remains unanswered: will these two brothers, who wrote some of the greatest rock songs in history, ever truly reconcile? Or is the silence between them the final song they'll ever write together? If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video and subscribe for more true celebrity stories every week.